Hi everyone, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think some people elected to perhaps go to another session. Some of you who've been here before have heard Greg Martin do this presentation. So I will get started. So we're going to be talking about internship, externship, and written arrangements. So on the agenda today we have consortium agreements, contractual agreements, required disclosures, duration of agreement, division of responsibilities, structure of the agreement, foreign institution eligibility as it pertains to written arrangements, ineligible programs, distance education, transfer credits, and internships. So there are two kinds of written arrangements that you can have under our regulations. A consortium agreement, which is a written arrangement between two or more eligible schools, and by eligible, we mean Title IV eligible. And a contractual agreement, which is an arrangement between a Title IV eligible school and an ineligible entity. And foreign institutions are never permitted to have a contractual agreement. So if you decide that you're going to enter into a consortium agreement with another Title IV eligible school, this means that students that are at your school, or what we call the home school, can go to the school that you have the consortium agreement, we call that the host school, and they can take classes there, and those classes are going to transfer back into the degree that they're earning at your institution. So the home school needs to give credit to that student for the courses taken at the host institution on the same basis as they would if they had provided the training at the home school. So this is assuming that you've obviously done some research and the academic standards are equal to the standards that you have at your institution. So you also have the option after the student has taken the classes to decline to grant credit if that student was not academically successful. So the grades that are received through a consortium agreement do not have to be included when you're calculating the student's GPA, but they must be included in calculating the percentage of credits earned versus attempted. And this is because you have to keep up with your satisfactory academic progress, and this is what Andy went into detail yesterday during his and Carla's presentation. So, of course, you're going to have to provide disclosures. As you know by now, we want you to tell your students absolutely everything, so there's no misunderstandings or confusion. So you want to make sure that students are aware of all the consortium agreements that you've entered into. And we've seen those when we've looked at your institution's web pages. Students can see where it is they can go and study elsewhere. You want to also make sure that you indicate the portion of the educational program that's going to be offered by you at your home institution, and also what is going to be offered at the host institution, so the students know exactly where they're doing each part of the program. You also want to make sure that you're naming the institution. Of course, that goes without saying, and where that institution's located, because there may be different locations in different places in the world. You also need to make sure that you indicate the method of delivery of that part of the program at the host institution, because remember that students enrolled at your institutions can't take any portion of their program through distance education. They need to be sitting in a classroom. So if there's some distance education classes that are part of what a student may be able to do at a host institution, that is not going to be eligible for an American student. And of course, you need to make your students aware of how much more money they're going to have to pay to do these other classes at the host institution. This might be a good time to remind your students that any additional debt they take on, it is a loan, and they are going to have to pay it back. So if they've already borrowed a substantial amount of money and they're looking to add 10, 15,000 more just so that they can do this sort of study abroad at a host institution, this is a good time, again, to make them aware that it is a loan and they need to think carefully before they borrow more money. So how long can you have your agreements go on for? Well, that's really up to you. We don't tell you how long your agreements have to be for. So they can go on indefinitely, and they don't need to be renewed unless something substantial material changes within that agreement. Then, of course, like any other contract, you're going to renegotiate it. So you can have limited agreements where you're entering into an agreement for perhaps one student or those for a specific group, and they will continue for the length of time that is defined within that agreement. In terms of who exactly is going to be taking care of the federal financial aid for the student, that's something that you need to determine with the host institution, because the home institution can do it or the host institution can do it. Now, if a student is only going to be gone for perhaps a semester, it probably doesn't make sense for the host institution to take on all that responsibility. It's better if it stays with you and you handle it. You have control over what's going on, and that probably just makes more sense. If the student's going to be gone for a substantial amount of time, then it might make more sense for the host institution to assume that responsibility. So this is something I'd actually never really thought about, but does everyone in here know what a third-party servicer is in terms of how we define that at the department? Does anyone know? Okay. It's not something that we see that foreign schools actually engage in very often. So a third-party servicer, in the way that we define it, is an outside organization that you contract with to administer part of your Title IV program. There are US institutions that decide that they're going to contract out certain portions because they're US institutions, they have huge numbers of students, so they will hire someone else to manage that portion of the program. So of course we have specific regulations around how third-party services operate, and they also have to produce a compliance audit in the same way that you do with when you prepare your compliance audit at the end of your fiscal year that you submit to us. Third-party services are always subject to that as well. So it had never occurred to me that when schools enter into these agreements, that consortium agreements, that there would even be a consideration of that. But obviously there was, because it's defined that you are not a third-party servicer. So that's probably good news, or you'd be subject to lots more regulations on top of all the ones that we give you anyway. So the institution that's going to disperse the loan to the student is the institution that then has to take on all the responsibility for maintaining the student's information on eligibility, the calculation of the award, and the money that's going to be dispersed. As I said, you can have a consortium agreement. It can be a blanket agreement between two or more eligible schools, or it can be for a specific student. So have any of you in here been approached by a student who has asked you to enter into a consortium agreement because they want to go and do something at a specific school? Has anyone agreed to do that for one student? That's really what I thought it would be. I've had students actually come to me and ask me why I can't force their school to enter into a consortium agreement so that they can do some particular classes that they want to do at a different institution. This is entirely up to you as the university whether or not you want to have that arrangement. So if a student comes to you and begs and pleads, as we know that they can do, and then contacts us at the department, if you don't want to do it, that is absolutely your right to say no, and we're going to back you up on that decision if the student comes to us. Excuse me. So there's no limit on the portion of a program that can be handled by the host institution. And of course, the agreements that you have are going to vary very widely based on the interests of both the institution involved. And again, I have to emphasize no consortium agreements with institutions in the US, because we have that whole prohibition on students attending foreign schools coming back to the US and pursuing education that's part of your program. The contents of the agreement, we do prescribe to you what you need to have in that agreement. So you've got to know who's going to grant the degree or the certificate. You need to have all the costs involved there, the student's tuition, fees, room and board costs at each school, what the student's enrollment status is going to be at each school, and again, which school is going to be responsible for dispersing direct loan funds and monitoring the student's eligibility. And also the procedures for calculating awards, dispersing aid, monitoring SAP, and other requirements such as record keeping. And then of course you have to stay on top of R2T4. If the student is at the host institution and you are as the home institution taking responsibility for that student, if that student drops out, you're going to have to determine whether or not you have to do an R2T4 calculation, which you are all intimately aware of now because of all the detail that Carla gave you yesterday on how to do those calculations. Want to talk a little bit about a foreign institution in terms of its eligibility as it pertains to written arrangements. So we know that a foreign institution is an institution that has no US locations. Unless you are a medical, veterinary, or nursing school, there are exceptions in terms of the clinical arrangements that these type of schools have for their students to come to the US and do the clinical training portion of their program. They can't do any of the classroom instruction, but they can do their clinical training in the US as long as there's an agreement in place. And also, you can't have an arrangement for an institution located in the US for students enrolling at your school and then just taking courses there. And let me just check something here. Okay, I'm going to skip that slide. So we don't, of course, prohibit participating foreign institutions from offering a program in the US. You can have a program, you just can't enroll American students into that program. And that program would never be eligible for Title IV purposes. And they're not eligible for funds for any portion of that program. So if inadvertently they come to the US and they do enroll in that program, and then they come back to you and they want to continue their program, they've invalidated their Title IV eligibility, and they now no longer can have funds to continue with that program. So that's something that you really want to make sure that you're providing information to your students so they're aware of that. Going to change now and talk a little bit about ineligible programs. So we keep hammering into you about distance education. And a distance education program can be a correspondence, which I'm not sure anyone offers correspondence programs anymore, or a program offered through direct assessment. I just want to take a minute and talk about direct assessment because it's actually a question that we ask on the electronic application, the e-app. In section E, where we're asking you to tell us about the programs that you offer, there is a sentence and then a little box where you're supposed to click yes or no if you offer direct assessment programs. So of course, when you're looking at this as a foreign school, it's been interpreted by many schools as direct assessment, that you're actually monitoring and grading and looking at your students. So it makes sense and you check yes. What we haven't done, and we won't do on the EAP because we're moving on to a new system, we haven't defined that at the department a direct assessment program is something that's just open to a very few number of domestic schools, and it has nothing to do with whether or not you're monitoring and grading your students. So if you check it, we're just going to ask you to uncheck it. But now, since I've told you that you don't have those programs, none of you will be making that mistake on your next EAP recertification. So an ineligible program is a program for which any portion of the program is provided by an entity that is not eligible to participate in the Title IV programs. And again, I mentioned the exception with the clinical affiliation agreements. And with limited exceptions, a program offered in whole or in part in the US. So, because you can't allow your students to do any portion of their program of study distance education, if you want to offer students a program that has, say for example, a program in accounting 101, and there's the option for students to take 2 of those classes online. The American students on Title IV can't take those 2 courses online because that's going to invalidate the entire program. So what you need to do is you need to create a separate version of that program. It needs to be distinct. So you've got Accounting 101A, which is the program that has the 2 distance education classes in it. Then what you need to do is create Accounting 101B that does not have the distance education 2 classes included. Those 2 classes are going to have to be taught in a classroom where the student and the instructor are physically present. It doesn't mean that that entire track B needs to be a completely separate program. So when your students are taking the portion of the program that's in a classroom, they can take those classes with the students who are in the track A, so that they mingle for that, and then they separate so that they get the other 2 distance education classes from A. They take them in track B and they sit in the classroom and do that. You have to make this information available wherever you publish the information for all the programs that you're offering. That's where this program needs to be published as well, so that students can easily find it, and then they're aware that they need to make sure they enroll in track B. So again, make sure that they know that it's published. And you need to make this available to not only the students enrolled at your school, but also prospective students, which is why we want that information included in all the programs that you're offering. So when students are looking at your school, considering it, and they're looking at programs, they will see that. And for all the information that you're required to provide to students, letting them know where to find information, you need to have a brief note about that in there as well. You can use distance education to supplement classroom instruction. So if there's a portion of the program where the instructor and the students are physically present, where you want to do some sort of distance, quote, education in that class, that's fine. Transfer credits. So we do not restrict an institution's discretion to award credit for courses completed at another institution. So if a student independently, and that means that they're not at your school and it's not part of their program, if they independently complete a direct loan ineligible class at an unaffiliated institution, you may decide to include those credits into the student's program. But again, with any academic institution, it's at your discretion whether or not you choose to accept those credits. And of course, the student may not receive Title IV funds for those courses, and hopefully that's because they've done it before they even come to your institution. I'm going to talk about internships, and I've already had some questions about internships here from some of you. Someone asked me whether or not we at the Department of Education define what an internship is, and we don't. So there's you're all familiar with the Foreign School Handbook and the fact that we've updated it. We have a new edition this year. There is some information on page 1.26 of the Foreign School Handbook that talks about internship, externship. So while there is the opportunity for a student to participate in internships, they are becoming more and more common, and we know that. Generally, it's not possible for students on Title IV at a foreign institution to undertake a program that has a required internship portion to it. And the reason for that is because it's usually going to be offered by an entity that is not Title IV. And because you can't have a contractual arrangement, that means that that student can't do any portion of that program, because you can't enter into a consortium agreement because they're not Title IV eligible. The only way that the internship may be possible for the student to do is if in the country where your institution is located, you have an outside agency that is evaluating those internships. And we're talking about an accrediting agency, a government body, but it is very specific about the oversight. So I'm just going to read the sentence from the handbook. So an internship has to be governed by explicit standards of an outside oversight entity, such an accrediting agency or government entity, that require the oversight and supervision of the institution where the institution is responsible for the internship or externship, and students are monitored by qualified institutional personnel. What we have found when we're handling your recertifications or your new applications is that we struggle to find agencies, we struggle to find institutions that have an outside agency that is performing these functions. Someone asked me yesterday if the sort of overall authority they get from their government body that authorizes them to function as a university and award degrees, if that wouldn't be enough, because universities are given autonomy to develop their own programs. And of course that means they're going to be developing internships, because in the same way the world is moving to distance education, students want to do internships in the field of study so that they're more experienced and more valuable when they go out and look for a job. But we struggle to find it, and the schools struggle to find this information too. In one particular instance at a school in one country, we could not, I think every single degree program offered had an internship mandatory requirement. So there was no government oversight that either we could find or the school could find. And so therefore, none of those degree programs were eligible, because if you require them to do an internship to earn that degree, and you can't meet what I just read, then that program is not going to be an eligible program. So, I'm ready for questions, and I think my lovely colleagues are going to run around with mics and ask away. If they get too complicated, I'm going to have you defer and ask them of Greg Martin when he comes here for the Q&A. Mike. Johnny, are the mics on?
Marcia, when you said that, for instance, let's say that despite our information and our cautiousness, we have a student who breaks the rules and without telling us goes to an ineligible institution for an exchange program, for instance. When you say it invalidates the entire program, does that mean that all the other students enrolled in the same program won't be able to benefit from their direct loans?
Did we decide, Mike, that that was yes or no? I think it depends. That's what I'm thinking. The problem is if a student, it can invalidate, it's going to, what it means is the student is not going to be able to receive any more funding for their program. I think I want to get, unless Mike can clarify that better than I'm not doing very well at, I'm going to ask Greg to address that because, and the reason I'm sounding a bit confused is because we have discussions at the department about is or isn't, and it goes back and forth, and I'm not quite sure what we actually decided on.
Yeah. I'll give a partial answer, I guess a non-answer. At a minimum, it would make that student ineligible for the remainder of his program. At a minimum, it would make that student ineligible for the remainder of his program. As far as making it retroactive or making that program ineligible for all students, that is a possible outcome, but what we're looking for there is internal controls. So do you have everything in place that Marcia covered, and is this really truly a case of a rogue student, or is it, that your institution wasn't closely monitoring the Title IV recipients? So, but like Marcia said, it is something that we've gone back and forth about. I don't know that Greg will have much to say since we are the enforcement unit.
He may not. So I guess one thing I want to emphasize, and this is an example in terms of distance education, which I know Evelyn gets a little bit away from the question that you've just asked, but kind of comes back to it in a roundabout way. You want to make sure that you have as much information published on your website for American students as to what they can do and what they can't do. And the reason I say this is because we had a situation I've been working with recently with a student who was in the military, and he was called to active duty. He was in another country. He was called to active duty back in the US. He was working on a PhD program, and he worked out with his professor that he would continue to work via distance education. He did not go to the financial aid office to talk to the people who were managing Title IV. He just worked this out. School didn't know where he was, so then he comes back and asks, that he needs to have money for the next academic year, and the school refused to give it to him correctly because he had done distance education. Now, unfortunately, even currently, even for military personnel who are called onto active duty, there is no discretion in how that regulation is implemented. There is information in the handbook for a school to review in terms of what military students can do if they are called to active duty, and they can be allowed to leave their program, and when they return back, they have to be admitted into that program in the exact space they were when they left. So they have some sort of cover, but they have no, there's no special regulation for them if they are on active duty and they happen to be in the US and want to continue with their program. So needless to say, the student was really upset. It is upsetting, particularly if you're military. and you don't have a choice where you're called to active duty. But he wrote to his congressional people, he wrote to us at the department, he wrote to the secretary. The school had done a really good job in publishing information on their website about what students needed to do if they were leaving, returning to the US, the information about no study in the US, no distance education. So this was documentation that I was able to use when I responded to all those letters to say, yes, it's unfortunate, but there's no discretion, and it was very clear on the school's website that this is what the student needed to do, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, he didn't do it. So I think any information that you can put onto your website that clarifies our regulations, especially what students are not allowed to do, covers you when we start getting these complaints, because usually when these students complain, they don't go to one congressperson, they write to the congressional people in their area, their senators, the White House, the Secretary of Education, us. Doesn't change the response they get, but it covers you when we're having to address these kind of tricky, ugly issues.
Okay. I would like to go back to the internship. We don't have mandatory, but we have the option. It's always going to be a part where the study board will acknowledge that it's a good internship. So if you're doing pharmaceutical studies, you can go to one of the companies. If you're doing political science, you can go to an embassy, stuff like that. Each program is accredited by itself, by the ministry, so I'm thinking that we actually have it, what you were talking about before, that we do have accreditation for each program, and also for a portion of it being perhaps internship if the student chooses, or a course if they choose that. Now, should I then tell them that they cannot have that option?
I think we would have to look at the language that you have in your approval to see whether or not it's very specific. And I would encourage you to take a look at this, at the Foreign School Handbook, page 126, because if you go back and reread what I read to you, which I did because there wasn't any other way to say that, it's very clear. I think that's helpful, and we'd be happy to look at your documentation to determine whether or not that would meet our requirements. But fortunately, in your case, if it doesn't meet our requirements, it's optional. It's not mandatory. So
that's the good thing, but I did feel covered when you said
it's
single program accreditation.
Yeah, it's really tricky, and because it's so specific, we found that it's hard for some countries to actually find language and oversight that meets our requirements. Mike?
Give her
Elise?
Elise, Elise
Elise.
used up all of her internship questions last year, so.
But I always have more. It's regarding the accreditation, this third party who is overseeing everything, this oversight.
The third-party servicer?
Yeah. Is it possible, well, we have our oversight, so but I was wondering if it is possible that, for instance, the AACSB who give accreditations, or the AMBA, or the EQUIS, this kind of institutions, would this be helpful or useful on this field?
Mike, did you work with Elise on her? I kind of think you know more about her particular school than I do.
Yes, we worked for a while last year together.
Phew.
Yeah, so those are accreditors, right? Like business accreditors, yeah. Any third-party oversight, we know a lot of business programs have accreditation that's regional, national. Some foreign schools have, for various reasons, like U.S. accreditation. All of that counts. Yeah, any third-party oversight.
And third-party third-party oversight is different from third-party servicer, just to make it more confusing or less confusing.
Thanks. I have two questions. The first one is just, can I get some clarification around, Andy, apologies now, but Andy mentioned at some stage yesterday, or somebody did, cooperative education. So I just want clarity on whether, when you talk about, are internships a no, and then, but cooperative education is a yes?
I'm not sure what cooperative education is.
Cooperative education is an integrated and credited part of a program that basically it's a work placement, but it's called cooperative education. It's a US, and we have it in Ireland. So
A co-op.
yeah. So can students do that?
Students so they're going outside of your institution to do something.
To do a work placement or an internship.
And that would be,
Yeah, it would fall
That-
under the
yeah.
same rules. And I'm not familiar with the Irish system, but I know the Canadian system has cooperative education, and they have a specific agency that will approve those co-ops, and I know that we've researched that. So we're happy to look into it with you offline.
Okay.
But I personally have never looked into the Irish cooperative education system.
Well, there's only one university offering it us, so
Oh.
that's when
Yeah.
we started.
Okay.
But it's modelled on the
Yeah.
US idea, so just.
You would treat it like an internship,
Okay,
and
okay.
I'm going to guess there's some type of third-party oversight,
Yeah,
probably.
yeah,
That,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And the second question, sorry, was just around the clinical electives. So students go, let's say for medical students going back to complete a clinical elective overseas. Am I right in thinking that we would have to have an agreement with any organisations that are or third-party organisations that our students are going to do a clinical elective with?
so you have a medical school?
Yeah.
So do you have clinical sites in the US where students are completing their clinical training?
They are doing it, but they're optional, they're not compulsory, and there's no credit awarded, so I'm just wondering if that's...
Well, and you have to have a clinical agreement in place if students are coming to the US with any institution where they're doing a large, let me take this another way. If students are doing 8 credits or less as an elective, you don't have to have a clinical affiliation agreement, correct, Mike?
Yeah, so this gets away from anything we're talking about here, and we're
Okay,
moving now into 600.55, which is the medical school regs.
Okay.
Yeah, and so in general, you would need a clinical affiliation agreement or some other written arrangement with any clinical site. But there are exceptions, and we won't go into great detail today, but if it's like less than 8 weeks and no more than 2 electives and it's not used regularly, then that's a possible exception. But again, don't want to speculate here without looking, maybe directly at your program. But in general, yes, there needs to be a clinical affiliation agreement, has to have certain elements for any site where your students might go to do a clinical
And
rotation.
I don't know which school you're from, but with other Irish schools that I've worked with, or at least one, there are clinical affiliation agreements in place, even where students are doing part of their training in a GP's office, general practitioner's office. So they've been able to provide those agreements. And actually, Harrison worked with the Irish. Are you in Northern Ireland or Ireland? Pardon?
Limerick.
Limerick, okay.
I'm working on that.
Talk to Harrison and Andy.
We'll work on it. Yeah, we'll work on it.
Any other questions?
Hi, we do a 4-year undergrad, and in the 3rd year they can have a year abroad. But until they get to that 3rd year, we don't know what institution they're going to choose, so we don't know in year 1 if it's going to be an eligible institution. They've all got agreements. So does that mean that they can have US loans for the first 2 years, and then not in the 3rd year if the institution they choose isn't an eligible institution, and then they don't get it in the 4th year?
I don't think it's that simplistic. I think that you will need to direct your American students to enroll in or choose another school to do that study abroad year that is a Title IV institution. that's where they're going to have to do.
So they've got to choose where they want to go in year 1 for their year 3?
Well, if you've got, you would just need to be able to, I don't know how many agreements you have, but you would need to determine which of those schools you have agreements with that are Title IV eligible schools, and that's where your American Title IV students need to be directed. And of course they can't come here to the US to do any of that.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Hi.
Hello.
I understand that the students can now do an internship with an external institution. My question is, if there is a think tank part of the university that does research, let's say in counterterrorism, and I have an MA student that wants to do an internship that is optional for credits, how do I know if the institution, like the think tank, is considered as an external or as part of the university? Is it determined by, you know, the way it's funded, or it's very specific, might be a in 2-hour question. I just wanted to throw it out there, maybe some
It's
other.
pretty complicated. I know I don't want to answer it now because I don't think there's a two-sentence answer. I think I'd encourage you to raise it with Greg, or if it's not, I don't know who's going to be at the session that we have, the Q&A, if it's going to be really busy, but if it's so specific, your question, that it just might be better to talk offline with Greg,
Yeah, okay.
or
thank you.
email it to me, and I'll get it to somebody to look at, because that's,
No, I know, I hesitated, but I thought maybe other schools also have that.
Well,
so
yeah,
maybe
no,
they
we
could, you know, react. That's why I asked.
we encourage you to bring up your questions, because you've seen from being here for a few days that some questions are being answered by other people in the audience, which is fabulous, because you've got answers that, you know, we don't have. And then also, you're right, there are the same issue going on in another school, and perhaps the school official doesn't want to raise it. So, no,
So-
go ahead and ask them. We always tell you, if we can't answer them, you know that by now. You come every year.
No, I know. I'll just ask
Sure.
Greg. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, I have a question. I think I know the answer, unfortunately.
Oh, good.
We have a museum conservation course. So the first year is wholly taught, and then in the second year, we have what we would call a placement rather than an internship, usually out to some national collection or other in London, something like that. So they are practicing and developing the techniques that they have been taught. I'm guessing you're going to say that is an internship. I mean, they are assessed by their lecturers who will go out and see them and obviously speak to the museum staff and see if they are using the skills they have learned and that kind of stuff. But would you call that, we call it a placement, would you say that's an internship and therefore it needs to somehow be at an accredited institution?
Well, I think with the UK, in terms of internship, we found some language that we're comfortable with. So, Mike, do you agree?
Yeah, because this was discussions Mike and I had previously. I'm from Bath University, and I sent loads of information because a lot of UK universities are governed by the QAA, who come and inspect us, and plus, like yourselves, all our placement programs have tutors that will go out and work with the students while they're on placement, go and inspect them, check they're doing okay, and that got agreed that that was okay for the UK and placement provision.
Anyone else? Okay, so are you all coming back for our Q&A session, or have you had enough of us and you're going to go have a glass of wine?
Don't have a glass of wine before the Q&A session. We don't want you to feel any braver than you already do.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you back.